I think that this topic will strike close to home, and we'll get to see how other people dealt with major pandemic conditions in ancient times and how that affected their political views and attitudes and capability for extending power. And so, as I promised, I'm going to talk about the plague of Athens, and then a little bit about the Athenians' response to it, and in particular, Pericles' response to them, because the plague has serious political ramifications, just like the current pandemic has had serious political ramifications. We can learn a lot from this. So Thucydides says that the plague struck near the end of the first year of the war, and there had been like rumors of it in pockets and parts of Greece, but it was particularly at the time that the Athenians had crowded within their city walls, as Pericles had asked them to do, in order to protect themselves and basically sacrifice the countryside to Spartan attack, so that they could use what they had to strike back with their navy. It struck during this time of overcrowding. It was very hot. And while Thucydides can't say, he doesn't know that caused, it probably didn't cause this plague, but he does say it greatly exacerbated it. And who could disagree with that? People crowded in these buildings, in these apartments behind the walls. They gave it to each other quickly. He says of the plague, much as he says of the Peloponnesian War, it was the greatest, in this case, disease he had ever lived through, ever witnessed. He says, a pestilence of such extent and mortality was nowhere remembered. Neither were the physicians at first of any service, ignorant as they were of the proper way to treat it, but they died themselves the most thickly. And this is something he mentions later too, that not only doctors, but people in generally were inclined to help each other, especially their loved ones during this time, and they exposed themselves to the sickness. And so anybody who would do that was going to die. And it was like, it was a tragic circumstance. Many of them died helping each other. And, you know, he, of course, over time says people's attitudes became like hardened and different as the disease raged, to the point where he said people started to lose faith in God and in gods. He said supplications in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found equally futile against the plague, till the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. Sorry about that typo, but I think you get it. And, you know, a lot of people have commented about this situation that, you know, hard pressed by the constant suffering that this plague brought, people began to lose their faith in the gods. They began to not pray. They stopped doing their sacrifices. And even when their loved ones died, they, after a while, stopped trying to give them proper burials with all the rituals and so on. And so it was pretty brutal. And he says that he got it. And he obviously didn't die from it, but he went through many of the symptoms. And he says, I shall simply set down its nature first. And this I can better do, as I had the disease myself and watched its operation in the case of others. So we're hearing from somebody who actually had the physical symptoms. And another thing I want to mention is, you know, people try to figure out, like, what was this? Was this Ebola? It might have been Ebola, or, you know, it had to be something, a major type of thing like that was horrendous in the suffering and in the mortality, more so than the coronavirus pandemic that we've been living through. And not simply because we have more measures against it, but I really get the feeling it's because this thing, whatever struck Athens, was like extremely deadly. And then you add on to that the fact that they didn't have any real defense against it. So I'm just going to read the description here, which is, you know, like It's so valuable. It's very detailed, and it gives you an idea of how much people were suffering. He says, people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes. The inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, became bloody and emitted an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were soon followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain soon reached the chest and produced a hard cough. Then it fixed in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind named by physicians ensued, accompanied by very great distress. In most cases, also, an ineffectual retching followed, produced violent spasms, which in some cases ceased soon after, in others much later. Externally, the body was not very hot to the touch, nor pale in its appearance, but reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. But internally it burned, so that the patient could not bear to have clothing on him, or linen, or even the slightest of the very lightest description, or indeed to be otherwise than stark naked. What they would have liked best would have been to throw themselves into cold water, as indeed was done by some of the neglected sick who plunged themselves into the rain tanks in their agony of unquenchable thirst. Though it made no difference whether they drank little or much. So imagine dead bodies floating in your water supply. Besides this, the miserable feeling of not being able to rest or sleep never ceased to torment them. The body, meanwhile, did not waste away so long as the distemper was at its height, but held out to marvelous degree against its ravages, so that when they succumbed to the disease, as in most cases on the 7th or 8th day, to internal inflammation, they had still some strength in them. But if they passed this stage and the disease descended further into the bowels, inducing a violent ulceration there accompanied by severe diarrhea, this brought on a weakness that was generally fatal. For the disorder first settled in the head, ran its course from thence through the whole body, and even where it did not prove mortal, it still left its mark on the extremities, for it settled in the privy parts, the fingers and the toes, and many escaped with the loss of these, some too with that of their eyes. Others again were seized with an entire loss of memory on their first recovery and did not know either themselves or their friends. So this plague, which eventually got Pericles and killed him, this was horrendous. Now you can imagine that people who had, just entered into this war and were suffering from this and had followed Pericles' advice and crowded into the city were A, thinking that maybe they had made the wrong choice about this war, and B, maybe they had made the wrong choice about Pericles. So more about that in just a second. But I wanted to point out, he also says that the disease was zoonotic. Now, normally we think of that as going from animals to humans because, for instance, the coronavirus happens this way, right? In a lot of cases, these viruses happen this way. If they're going to go from one to the other, it's animals to humans. But in this case, it went from humans to animals, or at least it went back to them. And so he says, like a lot of animals knew better than to eat the dead bodies. But if they did, they died after tasting them. Okay, so this is pretty horrible. He says, men not knowing what was to become of them became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. All the burial rites before in use were entirely upset. So again, irreligiosity struck and lawlessness descended apace. He says, men now coolly ventured on what they had formerly done in a corner, and not just as they pleased, seeing the rapid transitions produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying, and those who had before had nothing succeeding to their property. So they saw these sudden changes in fortune, with wealthy people being struck at the same rate as the poor, and actually the wealthy people dying and the poor taking their property. And people just decided they were going to do whatever they wanted to do, whether it was commit crime or whether it was party and steal other people's property, whatever it was. He says, fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. No law could restrain them. And of course, you can imagine the legal system was probably in shambles at this point. And there was no more conscience, because people were like, wait a minute, where is the justice of the gods? I've been taught that if I obey moral rules and the law, I'll be rewarded with a decent life, and that's no more. And in fact, it seems like the people who are the boldest are the ones who are, taking things. I need to do so as well. They judged it, he said, to be just the same, whether they worshiped gods or not, as they saw all alike perishing. For the last, no one expected to live to be brought to trial for his offenses. But each felt that a far severer sentence had already been passed upon them all and hung over everyone's heads. And before this fell, it was only reasonable to enjoy life. And that makes sense. And so this was an understandable reaction to a very horrendous situation. And then another understandable reaction is that they did turn against Pericles. Pericles, the great leader for a time, earned an incredible amount of wrath from the Athenian people. Thucydides says that after the Spartans had invaded the territory again, a change came over the spirit of the Athenians, and their land had now been twice laid waste, and war and pestilence at once had pressed heavy upon them. They began to find fault with Pericles as the author of the war and the cause of all their misfortunes, and they became eager to come to terms with Sparta, and actually sent ambassadors to them, who did not, however, succeed in their mission, because by now the Spartans were pretty emboldened, of course, but this happened again close after the first year of the war. The Athenians start to say to themselves, my God, like, we've made a mistake, and this plague, maybe it's the God's answer to us. Like, we shouldn't have done this, or at any rate, we're now like not in a position to want to carry on this war. And we think maybe Pericles' judgment was bad. And he says they now vented all their despair upon Pericles. And so Pericles gets up and gives a speech. This is obviously before he's become ill himself. And he tries to defend himself against this and the political ramifications of what all of this has done, both the war itself, the plague, the fact that they're seeing their country property burned to the ground, and he has to try to say, trust me, stay the course. So, I mean, right away, one of the things he says is, hey, look, I haven't changed. The circumstances have changed. And he kind of tries to put it back on the Athenians as being fickle. And they don't know how to stay the course and be firm and resolved in their convictions. Okay, so he says, I am the same man and I do not alter. It is you who change, since in fact you took my advice while unhurt, and now you've waited for misfortune to repent of my advice. Okay, that's typical politician stuff, like if necessary, gaslight your audience, right? Make them feel like there's something wrong with them for being angry that they trusted you, and now they're like dying of the plague and their property is being ruined, and they've gotten into a war that maybe they didn't need to, that's going to cost them a lot of money and a lot of lives, and they want out of it. And the only way a politician probably can deal with that and stay afloat is to see if he can, in a clever way, turn around and get people to blame their own judgment, or to like not see what's in front of their eyes or something like that. Okay. And then secondly, he scolds them, the Athenians, for not understanding what they've got. Okay. And again, I need to read this because it's like, but this is the crucial quote right there, but I'm going to read a little bit more because it's so indicative here of Athenians. The Athens' true position in the world really is as Pericles described, but the fact that he's having to describe it this way now means that prior to this time, people have lied to the Athenians, and they've lied in the sense of emphasizing the glory and the honor of Athens and its empire, which he goes back to later on in the speech. But they haven't emphasized enough the hard reality, because again, the hearer is too stupid. Like the blame is thrown back on the listener again here, by the implication that they should have known this all along, but they stupidly listened only to, the talk about glory and honor. So anyway, he says, oh, again, your country has a right to your services in sustaining the glories of her position. These are a common source, the glories of pride to you all, and you cannot decline the burdens of empire and still expect to share in its honors. Okay, there are burdens that come with empire. You should remember also that what you are fighting against is not merely slavery as an exchange for independence, but also loss of empire and danger from the animosities incurred in its exercise. To recede is no longer possible if indeed any of you in the alarm of the moment has become enamored of the honesty of such an unambitious part. In other words, if any of you are thinking about retreating now and backing away from this war and this empire, okay, you're not very ambitious. If any of you are thinking like this, remember, he says, for what you hold is, to speak somewhat plainly, a tyranny. To take it is perhaps wrong. It was perhaps wrong, but to let it go is unsafe. I think this might be the only time a politician actually says, we did something wrong. So he concedes that maybe it was wrong to accumulate this empire, especially the way that they did, by basically intimidating other cities and taking away their right to defend themselves. But he does that to make a powerful statement, right? Which is that, get real, people. Are you that stupid? This is an empire, and empires hold their cities by force. People fear us. And so if you let it go now, guess what's going to happen to you? They're going to attack. They're going to join Sparta. They're going to demolish us. We can't do that. So you need to wake up and grow up and, get with the reality that I and no one else has ever told you about before, because we weren't in a situation of desperation where we had to. Okay. So this is like a moment of truth. And I think it's a moment of truth that Thucydides very much wants the reader to realize, right? Pericles is telling the truth at this point, but it's not a truth that he ever told before. And they have been led down this path, the Athenians, with this, with stars in their eyes of the glory and the honor and the leadership, and, how much better they were at being an empire than Sparta was, and for all the right reasons. And this is very typical, right? Politicians tell you about these things. They only tell you the truth if there's absolutely no alternative and they're about ready to get the axe and it's their last option. Anyway, hopefully we can learn something from Thucydides regarding the effect of this level of disease and misery on people's political sentiments, right? It does sober you up. It makes you think about what's important. And suddenly some things like your national glory and your imperial power and wealth don't seem as important as just your comfort and safety. And I think this is what caused the Athenians to at least briefly decide, maybe we should try to treat with Sparta. Maybe we don't need this war. Maybe we just need to get back to normal. And then Pericles comes along, gives this speech, guilt trips people. Now he gets fined so that they kind of expiate their anger on him. And then of course later he dies, taking away the whole issue of Pericles. But in the meantime, they accept him again. They give him all the power to make the war decisions again. And Thucydides even says at this point that Athens was nominally a democracy, but it became in Pericles' hands government by the first citizen. And he says then with his successors, it was different because they were more on a level with one another, grasping at supremacy. So as we move forward, we'll talk about some of these other leaders who were more on a level with each other and grasped and were grasping for their supremacy. But Pericles himself grasped. He was just better at it than everybody else at the time, and people put their trust in him.